Hare Om Namaha. There are many myths, myths, connected to the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, and you need to psychically and spiritually free yourself from all of them. In this particular presentation, we're going to confront and expose 6 of them. These can be considered core myths, although the totality of those myths in connection to that deviated institution is certainly not limited to these alone. There are distinct and tangible benefits for you at all levels, not necessarily instantly, but sometimes that's the case. When you overcome even one of these myths, what to speak of all 6 of them? They're ingrained in the air quotes ISKCON movement as essential to its all-encompassing dogma. It can only have control over you if you believe in its dogmatic influences. This presentation will assist you in shattering such belief or such faith, which is naturally situated in the lower modes. The air quotes ISKCON cult will not pester you if you do so. You may be harassed to some extent psychically when overcoming these myths. You may have some unpleasant dreams or dramas as a side effect. However, the spiritual strength entailed by confronting the cult's institutional dogma will help to protect you from falling back into the black hole of its confederation. In other words, you'll no longer be attracted to any of that. The professionals who run the cult will not encourage their lackeys to keep trying to entice you back into so-called ISKCON if you've lost faith in the essential nescience it represents. Disconnecting from its belief system allows you to realize the freedom that entails, although there will, in all likelihood, be some trying times as you get free. That's the price you have to be willing to pay for believing in that deviant cult's dogma in the first place. You did not have the required sincerity, seriousness, and basic knowledge when you threw in with so-called ISKCON, so there's ultimately no reason that you should feel resentment and bellyache about some flotsam that comes out of the back of that boat. During the span of your spiritual life in Kṛṣṇa consciousness, and this would also include pseudo-Kṛṣṇa conscious connections, you have been fed myths, myths, about Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement. How could it be otherwise? There were so many deviations running and gaining traction in the 70s and the 80s. Many of them covertly, even while he was still physically manifest, that the colossal hoax which had to go down after he left was a stone-cold metaphysical lock. Prabhupada had warned us about much of it, but those warnings were not heeded by his leading secretaries. As such, its myths spawned an air quotes ISKCON narrative, which morphed into different rationalizations after the first imposition of the narrative ran its course, which of course that was the zonal acharya narrative. About a decade after that one, another very different one emerged from the ocean of nescience, and then but another one. There are obviously different myths connected to these two backlashes from the first one. For the purposes of an overview, you need to understand something integral to all such deviations. They are engineered by professionals. The real leaders of the air quotes ISKCON religion are all professionals. They're expert cult manipulators. They may appear to be institutionalists for their own purposes, and in so-called ISKCON, many of them are institutionalists, but they need not be. The professionals know the black art of how to manipulate their chelas and suck them into their vortex. They do that effectively, just like professionals in every walk of life do. Always remember that Humpty was pushed. The current Prabhupada-centered deviations, so-called ISKCON and Rittvik, did not just somehow or other emerge on their own. They were created, insinuated into the movements they formulated and formed, and then implemented. When it was a time for a change, the professionals know how to arrange for a new outcome via a different dispensation. This, to some degree, entailed tweaking the myths and the dogma, at least some of it, that were upholding the previous false dispensation. However, the professionals, as accomplished cult manipulators, did not find that too overwhelming a situation to confront and overcome. They had a captive audience. The institutionalists who were not professionals nevertheless still thrived in the new dispensation because they were needed to buttress the roof erected over genuine Kṛṣṇa consciousness. The chelas of various sorts mostly all fell in line. There are heavy-duty professionals in so-called ISKCON, in Neomat, and in Rittvik. It is not that they overtly appreciate each other, of course, that would be unnecessarily risky, but they do recognize one another. After all, they were all part of the general deviant scheme of things even before Prabhupada departed. They already knew how to subvert his movement to their own personal advantages, and they did just that. Now, for the ones initially left unsatisfied with the first dispensation, the others who weren't part of the 11, they found their figurehead in Navadvip and then proceeded to formulate and form Neomat. For the other malcontents, who were not satisfied to join either of these disparate camps, sometime later they formulated and formed the Rittvik concoction. All of them are cult manipulators from back in the day, which saw them take advantage of a captive, intimidated, and compulsive membership, some of which were ripe to make a switch. Even the hatchet men were in this latter category because they had no power to actually manipulate bewildered chelas as did the professionals. The powerful institutionalists with big-time name recognition, although higher than the sycophants, also did not have the power. The power was only with the cult professionals. And that is where it will continue to remain. There are myths that these Machiavellians utilize in order to keep all of the various categories of chelas entranced, keep them compulsive, and especially keep them fearful. 5 of those myths will be confronted and deconstructed in this presentation, and that will give you the opportunity to burn them out of the matrix of your astral body as long as you're willing to do so. Now you may ask, why not give us the names? The answer is this: the time will eventually come for that. Your host speaker has no need to prematurely engage in doing so, as the kala for it is not yet ripe. Critical mass must be attained before that can be accomplished, because the professionals will, if specifically attacked too early, counter and shift the momentum, which is now working against them, back into their favor. However, people are catching on. Do your diligent research. There's enough information out there for you to put the specific pieces of the puzzle together, including with the names you now crave, if you're persistent and resourceful enough to tackle the project. Provisionally, when critical mass is attained, part of its accomplishment will include the fact that many people of the host Western culture, including their political, religious, and semi-spiritual subcultures, will be able to see what they cannot see now. That will spell the death knell of so-called ISKCON, of Niyamat, and of Rittvik. The professionals in each of those camps know this, but such critical mass is not a foregone conclusion. So let us begin with myth 1. Myth 1, the institution remains pure no matter what. This is a kind of mostly subterranean energy, a belief that is strong and all-pervading in so-called ISKCON. Not all of its members are imbued with it, but many of them are. It is a mostly unrecognized core dogma of so-called ISKCON. It is cent% in the category of faith. For the cult's followers who fanatically believe in it, they will stick with so-called ISKCON no matter how ridiculous their cult scandal and deviation is. They all also believe that it's all an essential test of any Prabhupada disciple to believe that the institution remains pure no matter what, whether from back in the day, namely 1966 and through 77, or from latter times. It can also be called loyalty to the institution no matter what. Now, I intentionally choose not to entitle it Loyalty to ISKCON because ISKCON has been murdered by the deviant, air quotes, ISKCON creeper for decades running. Labeling this undercurrent as loyalty to so-called ISKCON is not what they believe, of course. They believe that ISKCON still exists and that it will always exist, at least throughout the Golden Age. The emotional energy permeating this dogma is the belief that ISKCON was endowed with a quality and power allowing it to be compared directly to the Ganges. No matter what the contamination that floats atop it, or for a moment in time, and the chief example of a moment in time would be the Zonal Acharya epic. For a moment in time, that contamination, that scandal, that deviation, it does not actually enter their cult because it is allegedly spiritually prophylactic. In order to make progress in Buddhi Yoga or Bhakti Yoga, you cannot be under the whammy of this powerful dogma. Emotionally, you must free yourself from any belief in this idea. It is obviously a self-serving and self-perpetuating feeling, strongly encouraged, even if that is only through vibration, by the leaders of so-called ISKCON. The chelas who hold this sentiment, especially those who hold it fanatically, will stick with the institution no matter the depth of its outrage or deviation. We have already had 3 major deviations since the spring of 1978. This proves that a sector of Prabhupada's originally initiated disciples, along with many newcomers, have stuck to the institution despite the deviations. They have done so despite glaring anomalies explained away via rationalizations chock full of contradiction. Now let us proceed to myth 2. Myth 2 is, the institution can never be scattered and lost. At the Battle of Kurukshetra, Lord Kṛṣṇa was accomplishing many purposes. He was facilitating revenge for the outrageous insult to Draupadi during the Asat-sabha, where she was stripped, unsuccessfully, in front of all the Kshatriyas present there. He established Yudhishthira as the actual emperor, replacing the false king, Duryodhana, who did not deserve the crown. He was testing Arjuna's devotion to him. And he was establishing the spiritual science and the reality of the absolute truth for millennia by enunciating Bhagavad Gita in front of all the warriors assembled, and that, of course, is stated in chapter 4, verse 2. Consult the endnotes, if you please. All of his many objectives were accomplished during those fateful 18 days, but one is sometimes overlooked. He was also reestablishing a sampradaya, in which Arjuna was to be the new leader in the disciplic line because it had been scattered and lost. There is a major ramification connected to that important truth and objective. A genuine disciplic succession of Bhakti Yoga, either as a branch or a line, had warped to such an extent that the actual spiritual science it was supposed to pass down through gurus was no longer a valid representative of the absolute truth. Now, consider that the practitioners of yoga back then within spiritual lines, that they were far, far more advanced than what Prabhupada was afforded as his disciples. Back then, over 5,000 years ago, they were much more advanced in all important personal and cultural categories. They were immeasurably more advanced than all the 60s and 70s, unwashed hippies, clever sociopaths, crummy pseudo-Marxists, seedy perverts, decadent wankers, obnoxious psychopaths, petty criminals, and squalid losers of every sort who drifted into Prabhupada's branch of Lord Chaitanya's Hare Krishna movement. They did so mostly to escape the Vikkarmic reactions plaguing them at every moment. 5,000 years ago, people in Vedic culture lived much longer. They had far greater power of memory as well. Brahminical culture was almost accessible to all of them, and Brahmins were respected for good reason. Realized Brahmins, not devotees, but still advanced in terms of knowledge, were relatively easy to contact. Prabhupada's disciples had no such personal assets or cultural access. Now, he said in a letter that Kṛṣṇa only sent him second-class men. Really? Fifth-class men is more like it. They had been engaged in daily sinful activity previous to surrendering him as neophytes, for as long as that lasted. Yet over 5,000 years ago, a genuine line of Kṛṣṇa consciousness was scattered from its founding principles and teachings to such an extent that it had to be separately reestablished by the Supreme Lord himself. And you actually think that Prabhupada's movement would somehow or other be immune from also degrading into such a fate? Wake up and guess again. Prabhupada established the BBT separately from ISKCON because he knew that ISKCON could become corrupted, which it certainly has been in every way possible. Ironically, the corruption was so deep that the BBT does not even legally exist anymore as a viable entity due to being split by those who could accomplish that into two new entities. Yet the dogma peddled in so-called ISKCON is that it can never become so corrupt as to be no longer a genuine branch of the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya. The dogma is that it will last as a viable movement of Bhakti Yoga for the duration of the Golden Age. It will not. Free yourself from this false belief. It's based upon a myth. As far as the reality of the situation is concerned, Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement has already been scattered and lost almost entirely. It's hanging by a thread. His leading secretaries and their sycophants, their vested interests and the hatchet men, made sure of that. The institutional remnant of what is left is nothing more than a paundraka, a pretension, just like the 11 great pretenders made it so in the late 70s and early 80s. Let us now proceed to myth 3. Myth 3 is the 11 rittviks were already dīkṣā-gurus. We're referring here to the 11 rittviks reappointed in July of 77. Now this myth, is the corollary derived from the big lie, namely that Prabhupada appointed those 11 great pretenders when he named the 11 rittviks in July of 77. The so-called appointment tape, which none of the devotees had access to, as it was squirreled away in a vault in L.A., supposedly was the proof of their appointment as dīkṣā-gurus. It was the appointment that never was. But this fact did not surface in any meaningful way until November of 1980. This gave those 11 men enough time to fill the centers within their zones with mostly their own improperly initiated disciples and jettison out of their centers their doubtful godbrothers, those who did not accept them as really perfect. Once the big lie was thoroughly exposed, rationalizations concerning the whole zonal acharya scheme had to be concocted. The main one was that since the GBC was allegedly non-different from Prabhupada, even though he did not appoint the 11 as gurus, the GBC did. As such, according to this rationalization, those 11 were appointed by him through this warped, transitive logic meant only for damage control. However, there was a kind of mostly but not entirely subterranean concoction which slowly spread, one which would not necessarily fail if the first GBC rationalization cratered, which it eventually did. Now, that concoction was that the appointment by Prabhupada of those rittviks was a recognition by him that they would become initiating gurus once he left the scene. This dogma meant that they were already, in July of 77, qualified to be dīkṣā-gurus, but Prabhupada allegedly eased them into that by appointing them first as rittviks. This belief is still present in so-called ISKCON, but it can be shattered rather easily. The first truth which unmasks it is palena parachiyate, judge by the results. What were the results of those 11 taking over the movement 4 months after Prabhupada departed? The results, after a very short-term jolt of energy, were disastrous. Do I have to list all the hells those 11 great pretenders put everyone through in the Hare Krishna movement? The scandals, the flipping of zones, the murders at Moundsville in L.A., the degeneration of the PIC, the internecine wars. All of that horror, and more than that was just listed, is conclusive evidence that none of those men was a qualified spiritual master. If you think that Prabhupada did not know where they were all at, his own disciples, and covertly recognized them as gurus, then your allegiance to him is spiked with faithlessness. Also, as early as 1970, in 2 separate but almost identical letters to 2 of those men, Prabhupada let it be known that he wanted his disciples to initiate newcomers while he was still physically present, hopefully no later than 1975. Consult the endnotes for that quote from the letters. The etiquette rationalization that he had to first appoint them as rittviks while he was still active here on earth, it has no basis. Because he made it clear in those 2 letters that he did not want to observe it if he found that any one of his disciples was a qualified spiritual master. None of them were in 1977. So, to reestablish initiations, which had been put on hold for many months, he appointed 11 rittviks, not gurus. And all of them had been rittviks before. They all knew the ceremonial processes involved, and their appointment in July of 1977 was nothing out of the ordinary. Prabhupada was still the only real guru, and none of his disciples had passed his tests and took the training he offered in order to be qualified as guru. You can consult the endnotes for proof of that. The appointment of those 11 rittviks as a cover of their actual glories until he departed is a myth. Do not believe it for a moment. It is, air quotes, ISKCON dogma, meant for the trash heap of history. We shall now proceed to myth 4. Myth 4 is GBC has an automatic self-corrective mechanism. Oh yeah. GBC has an automatic self-corrective mechanism. Oh yeah. The governing body commission is mentioned in only a few places in Prabhupada's purports to his books, which are destined by providence to become the law books of mankind throughout the remainder of the Golden Age, but only after we get past this present difficult passage in time, which is very bad. However, that they are mentioned in the books, in his books, in a few places, does not mean that the GBC is absolute. As an example, the previous Gurukul in Dallas is specifically mentioned also in the books, but that school in Texas merged into oblivion decades ago. There will not be a Gurukul in Dallas for the duration of the Golden Age. A devotee of Prabhupada, one of his first, is mentioned by name in one of his purports, but that man has been dead for over a decade. Something that you need to understand is that the Guru, although he mostly speaks and writes about eternal topics, is not restricted to only speaking and writing in that way. He can make points based on current situations which can and will change in course of time. Prabhupada wrote about an incursion into Indian territory by China in one of his purports while he was still in India in the early 60s. That does not mean that such a military incident is immortalized as permanent in what is prophesied to become the law books of mankind for thousands of years. Tattvamasi. The Shastric principle being discussed here is Nitya and Naimittika, eternal and incidental. The GBC is in the latter category. So-called ISKCON is the glove, and the vitiated GBC is the hand within that glove. It is the controlling node of so-called ISKCON. It holds great sway. And it has presumed unto itself all kinds of powers. Indeed, it considers itself to be the ultimate authority of so-called ISKCON in all matters, both material and spiritual. This last statement must be understood in context because there's a bit of truth in it. I'm not going to get heavy into that. The GBC, however, was never meant to be the all-encompassing controller of Prabhupada's branch of Chaitanya's movement while it was bona fide. The GBC was primarily an advisory entity. Check the endnotes for a quote establishing that. The presidents at that time had more de facto power than the governing body, and that was the way Prabhupada wanted his movement to run. However, after he departed physical manifestation, the GBC misused a sentence in his final will and testament in order to claim ultimate control of everything. Since ISKCON was then converted into so-called ISKCON at the beginning of the zonal Acharya debacle, and the GBC's fingerprints were all over that conversion, the GBC was converted into the vitiated GBC. As such, it does have complete control over anything and everything connected to so-called ISKCON. Now, this introduction that I just gave you was necessary in order to set the stage for the chief point being made here. That is, in relation to the belief, the myth, that while Prabhupada's movement was still bona fide, and the GBC was still functioning the way it was meant to function, however sporadically, that the GBC had an inherent or intrinsic power to always self-correct itself if somehow or other it deviated in advising the movement. Now, as I already mentioned, it would be counterproductive to get heavy into all the particulars, because doing so would distract from what is being communicated to you here. What is being communicated is meant to uproot the myth underlying air quotes ISKCON dogma that the commish automatically can be relied upon to self-correct. It was never empowered in that way, and it has not done so. There is no evidence anywhere in Prabhupada's statement about such an empowerment, no writings about it, no letters about it, and the GBC was mentioned very often in his letters, that's for sure, nor in any official documents that the GBC had or ever has had an automatic self-corrective mechanism intrinsic to its creation. Its founding document mentions no such thing. And it did not self-correct during the 1972 centralization scheme it put into motion. Prabhupada had to interfere. It did not self-correct after allowing 11 of its own, the most powerful amongst the group of 24 commissioners then constituting it, to impose the zonal Acharya scam. The second transformation of the collegiate compromise in the mid-80s was not a self-correction by the commish. Instead, and just the opposite, it was a new deviation or dispensation replacing the zonal deviation, which had run its course in every imaginable way possible. Now, do we have specific evidence that Prabhupada never recognized the GBC as having an inherent self-corrective mechanism? We have plenty of conclusive evidence to that effect, and here's but one example, quote, "And I am surprised that none of the GBC members detected the defects in the procedure. It was detected only when it came to me. What will happen when I am not here? Shall everything be spoiled by GBC? Unquote. There could be no such anxiety if the governing body commission had an automatic self-corrective mechanism embedded in its institutional being. And notice, in that excerpt, Prabhupada uses the word shall. Subtly, this indicates that he was telling us in advance that just such a deviation, for example, engineered by the vitiated GBC in the form of the zonal acharya catastrophe, would ruin his movement after he could no longer interfere to reverse such institutional shenanigans. You are advised to reject the self-serving myth that the GBC has some kind of automatic self-serving corrective mechanism in it. Those who sentimentally or fanatically cling to this dogma believe that the vitiated GBC will eventually make everything all right again. It will never do any such thing. It is a flawed and temporary entity that controls a flawed and temporary Sahaja movement. Nothing more. We shall now proceed to Myth 5. Myth 5 is, there are many qualified dīkṣā-gurus in so-called ISKCON. First of all, please note that there are at least 5 corollaries to this particular self-serving belief. So now I'm just discussing the corollaries and not directly that this idea, this dogma of many qualified dīkṣā-gurus in ISKCON. I'm talking about the corollaries, what are related to it. One of them is that the Madhyam Udhikari is not a perfect man. Another one is that there are many Madhyam Udhikaris in so-called ISKCON. Another one is that the guru does not need to be a very perfect man. Another one is that if you do not believe that there are Madhyam Udhikaris in so-called ISKCON who are qualified to be dīkṣā-gurus, then that means you do not believe in Prabhupada, because he would then have to be judged as having been unable to create Madhyams. Get that one? Rascaldom. Another one is that as soon as he gave his disciples sannyas, it meant that he recognized them as qualified dīkṣā-gurus and Madhyamadhikaris. Now let's first establish the through line. And what's the through line? It is as follows, quote, the guru must be a very perfect man, unquote. March 2nd, 1966. As many of you know, those of you who follow my posts and either listen or read them each month, or both, I've repeated this definitive statement from Prabhupada many times. Such repetition is wanted. Also, please note, he made this statement before he initiated his first disciples. As such, its overall importance is made all the more imperative. It's the through line. Neophytes cannot be gurus, either in general, which means shiksha guru, or specifically as initiating spiritual masters. Neither neophytes or Mishra Bhaktas can perform a proper spiritual and devotional initiation, what to speak of Sahajiyas. All such newcomers accepting dīkṣā from neophytes or Mishra Bhaktas or Sahajiyas are improperly initiated devotees. Prabhupada gave sannyas as an incentive. This was risky. Prabhupada took many risks. He took the biggest risk of all by coming to the West in the first place, and he did so as a vibrant, but nevertheless old man. That risk paid off big time. It was rewarded. We're all grateful to him for taking it. But that does not mean that all of his risks panned out or were successful. Some results were mixed. Some flat out failed. That's the nature of risk, no matter who takes it, even an Uttama. The track record of Prabhupada's sannyasis was abysmal. There's no need to go into all of those sordid details. The same thing went down in Gaudiya Mat, as Prabhupada has established in at least one of his purports, that many, if not all of his god brothers were neophytes. Of course, some of them were not neophytes, they're lower than that. At any rate, no big deal. How could that not also play out in the same way in his movement? In point of fact, it most certainly did. No one reached the status of being an advanced devotee, and please note that the Madhyamadikari is just that. He's an advanced devotee. Check the end note on that. But it cannot be pinned on Prabhupada that they didn't reach that stage. It cannot be pinned on him. He gave them plenty of knowledge and plenty of training, which they did not adequately take. Making the statement that none of his disciples who received sannyas advanced to the point of Madhyamadikari, making that statement is not at all outrageous. Now, for the purpose of a fair consideration, we shall present a theoretical vision presently, a theoretical vision of the past. Now, I'm not going to disguise the fact that the historical record gives us still a plethora of evidence that it was true that there were no Madhyams back then, and that it's not outrageous to assert this conclusion is either very probable or, let's go to what is really the case, a near certainty. But as promised, let us theoretically say that there were a handful of Madhyams in the movement just after Prabhupada left the scene. What then happened to all of them? If we continue with this theoretical example, what happened to those Madhyams when the great pretenders did their thing by claiming themselves as successors to his divine grace? Theoretically, if such Madhyams existed, if they existed, they would have been obliged to speak up against that imposition. If they even existed, did any of them do so? Only one prominent man did so, and then he went on to take the title of Prabhupada for himself. If any Madhyams even existed, how many of them cooperated with the first transformation of the zonal acharya scheme? Almost all, if not all, of the institutional sannyasis in the movement at that time fell in line and backed the new dispensation, which was a massive deviation. That is called anartha. A genuine sannyasi cannot be engaged in anartha of any sort, personal or institutional, and remain a madhyam udhikari. If he was a guru in general, which means a dīkṣā-guru, he would have immediately fallen down from that position. Anyone who cooperated with so-called ISKCON after the Asat Sabha of the Mayapur annual meeting in the spring of 1978 could no longer be a madhyam if he was one before that. If he recognized those zonal acharyas as successors, that would be an anartha and direct cause of fall down. If he recognized any of those improperly initiated disciples by those so-called successors spawned from those 11 great pretenders, that would also have been engagement in institutional anartha. Remember, for most of 1978, no one in the institutionally recognized upper echelons of so-called ISKCON had broke away to form his own group. Only one wild card did. And now of those institutionally recognized upper echelons, that certainly includes what became a bit later the emergence of Niyamat in the form of the Mahamandala and then the Guardian of Devotion. It's now called, of course, something else. In point of fact, although some of those, air quotes, ISKCON sannyasis who still stayed, which almost all of them did, they were disgruntled that they had not been recognized by the vitiated GBC as dīkṣā-gurus, but they made no effort to speak up. When all hell broke loose in early 1978, in what was then converted into the, air quotes, ISKCON movement, the whole environment in that deviated cult was suffused with opposition, faithlessness, aggression, and dominated by toxic masculinity. It was aggressively bogus, and any Madhyam Adhikari, if one even existed, and that's very doubtful, could neither have survived or thrived in it. Indeed, its most powerful leaders were no longer neophytes or Mishra Bhaktas. Instead, they were all in the category of Sahajiyas, some more flagrant than others. That contamination continues to this day, although it's subtler. A kindler, gentler version of an institutional delusion, now infused by the Hindu hodgepodge, is not an environment wherein a Madhyam Adhikari can survive. What to speak of any so-called Madhyam being created from the thousands of improperly initiated newcomers spawned over all these decades of time. The so-called ISKCON dogma that there are many Madhyam Adhikaris in the cult, and therefore many dīkṣā-gurus qualified to transmit the Bhukti Lata Bij, is rubbish. It's utter nonsense. We shall now proceed to myth 6. Myth 6 is that so-called ISKCON will fulfill the every town and village prophecy. In the months of November and December of 1971, Prabhupada wrote letters to 3 of his leading secretaries, each of them containing related messages about the future. In this case, we're going to have to presume the distant future. The second letter in November was almost identical to the third letter, so we shall not reproduce it here. So let's take a listen to the first letter. Quote, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has forecast that this Hare Krishna mantra will be heard in every nook and cranny of the globe. He is God, so it will happen. That is a fact. So if we take advantage, then we may take the credit, but if we do not, someone else will, unquote. Now we'll go to the third letter. Quote, actually he, referring to the Supreme Lord, Lord Chaitanya, actually he has said that this KC movement will spread to every nook and corner of the world, so there's no doubt it will happen. He is God, so how can he be wrong? So it will happen. So if we are intelligent, we will assist and get the credit. Otherwise, someone else will, unquote. You all can easily intuit what part of each of these excerpts I'm going to emphasize. But all 3 of them produce a similar conclusion, do they not? First of all, as of late 1971, the Hare Krishna message of Lord Chaitanya had not spread to every nook and corner of the world because Prabhupada was speaking about it as a future development. Was that forecast? Was that prophecy fulfilled in the short next 6 years while he was still with us? Some may opine that it was, yet such an opinion is highly doubtful. If it had been fulfilled, would not Prabhupada have definitively stated that it was then fulfilled? He never made such a statement. The most significant parts of these excerpts, repeated in all 3 of them, was their ending. The clause, quote, then someone else will, unquote. Does this indicate that his movement may not be the vehicle to spread the Hare Kṛṣṇa Maha Mantra to every town and village of the world? It is self-evident that it does. Why else would he include that clause in the letters about the Chaitanya movement spreading to every nook and cranny of the world? This question may be justly raised. First of all, does ISKCON even exist anymore in order to accomplish the fulfillment of the prophecy? Even if you are a flagrant optimist and believe that ISKCON does still exist, at least admit that it is now completely covered over by the weed that strangled it in the late 70s, namely so-called ISKCON. Can so-called ISKCON fulfill the prophecy? Can a deviant institution shot through with sahajiyas, mishra bhaktas, covert materialists, fanatics, and chelas of various warped sorts, can that be the vehicle? Certainly it cannot. Since the late 70s and early 80s, the deviant remnants of Prabhupada's originally pure branch of the Hare Krishna movement have been engaged in a fierce internecine struggle for supremacy. This has not gone unnoticed in the Western host culture, nor in India, which is also mostly westernized now. If you agree with the rather obvious fact that just previous to this, Prabhupada's movement had not yet spread the mantra and message to every town and village of the world, that there was still plenty of work to be done in this connection, how can you possibly believe that it has been accomplished after he departed? A Sahajiya enterprise divided into 3 warring camps can never fulfill the prophecy, which means someone else will have to do it. That it is already fulfilled or soon to be fulfilled by so-called ISKCON is nothing more than wishful thinking. It's a myth underlying the dogma that so-called ISKCON is the agent of Lord Chaitanya's movement and the agent of the eventual spread to every town and village of his name and his glories. There is plenty of evidence that this cannot happen and that it cannot be achieved by that institution. And, simple question here, why did Prabhupada even add that clause in that sentence at the end of all 3 letters? There's no need to add it if it couldn't take place. He had to add it because it was a distinct possibility that his movement would deviate, and the eventual spread would be accomplished by someone else via a future Mahabhagavat's movement. The colossal hoax known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is a pseudo-spiritual scam. Its dogma relies upon myths that have no substance, that are false, yet believed and spread by rascals and idiots susceptible to believing them. Reject that dogma and save yourself from where it will otherwise lead you if you don't get out now. And those clever sociopaths I mentioned earlier, some of those, the worst of the lot, are today's ISKCON professionals. Sadeva Samya.